On July 21, 1945, Berlin was engulfed in an atmosphere of celebration and triumph. The streets of the city were filled with the rumble of tanks, the clatter of boots, and the sounds of military bands. Thousands of Germans greeted the marching soldiers, waving flags. It was a victory parade, but not the one you would expect. It was a British victory parade. The winner, British Prime Minister Churchill, looked down at Berlin from a high rostrum, bestowing his affectionate smile on the city. The previous 2 months of Soviet occupation had made the people of Berlin look forward to the arrival of the British, as if they were their saviors. And now this day has come. One of the German women recalled, "The British were walking along the pavement, waving white canes. If they had stayed another week, I would have killed myself." However, during these 2 months, the Soviet Union accomplished the seemingly impossible for Berlin. The city presented a terrifying picture. Buildings destroyed to the ground, a flooded subway, destroyed infrastructure. To this were added diseases, hunger, and lack of power in an area of 400 square kilometers where 3 million Germans lived. Under these conditions, the actions of the USSR to save Berlin can be called a real miracle. Friends, in this video, there will be only facts from the Germans and the Soviet Union. Subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to leave your comments. The report sent to Stalin on the day of Churchill's Victory Day parade in Berlin contained impressive figures indicating the rapid restoration of the city under Soviet rule. Queues have disappeared in Berlin. The children received sufficient milk. 65,000 liters were delivered daily from nearby villages. 5,000 cows were handed over to German farmers. The foci of infection have been eliminated. The food warehouses and the sewage system have resumed operation. 120 medical institutions have been opened, including hospitals, polyclinics, and maternity hospitals, as well as 145 pharmacies. Electricity supply was restored in 33,000 residential buildings, and 85,000 buildings were repaired. The Berlin Metro and tram lines, as well as local businesses, have resumed operation. Coal was supplied from Silesia in echelons. 100 shops, 50 restaurants, 4 theaters, 200 cinemas and cabarets have opened. 857 German teachers have started working in schools. The publication of newspapers has resumed. Hundreds of Germans sought positions in the Soviet occupation administration. On the streets of Berlin, Germans could be seen blowing police whistles issued by the Soviet authorities. The commandant of Berlin, General Berzarin, sincerely rejoiced at the rapprochement with the German population. Despite the memory of what the Germans had done to Stalingrad, he sought to show the people of Hitler's lair that hatred could remain in the past and it was possible to build new relationships. General Berzarin, in his notes of those days, noted the amazing willingness of the Germans to cooperate. "All my orders are being obeyed. It amazes me that the Germans, who suffered so much under Hitler's regime and were incredibly exhausted by the long war, are now so sincere in their desire to help us." However, as time has shown, his assessment of the situation was too optimistic. In fact, the attitude of Berliners towards the Soviet troops was complicated and contradictory. They showed good-naturedness during the day and latent hostility in the evening. This clash of cultures has become the largest in the history of relations between Russians and Germans. The people of Berlin showed ambivalence in their behavior. During the day, they helpfully offered cigarettes to Soviet soldiers in parks. But in the evening, in their kitchens, they sarcastically called the stale bread crusts from Soviet rations Stalin's cakes, and criticized the Russians for exporting factory equipment to the east. One of the Soviet officers later recalled, "Berlin has been completely ours for 2 months. This is too short a period to strengthen relations with the civilian population." However, the problem was not only the lack of time to win the sympathy of the Germans. Paradoxically, the Berliners received the British and Americans with delight, without even seeing them and without receiving any real help from them. The hostility between the Germans and some of the Soviet citizens had deep roots going back to the scale of suffering and bloodshed on the Eastern Front. Unlike the fighting in the West, where the Germans did not pursue a policy of total annihilation, their actions in the USSR were incomparably more brutal. They were not limited to military purposes, but systematically exterminated civilians, looted houses, burned entire villages, and drove people out into the cold. Awareness of the gravity of the crimes committed on Soviet territory and a sense of guilt increased the hostility of the Germans. Despite Stalin's efforts to provide food to Berlin at the expense of the Soviet people, the attitude of the Germans did not change. They could not believe that such crimes would not be met with cruel retribution. Paradoxically, it was easier for the Germans to accept the British and Americans than the Russians who offered bread. All Berlin's hopes were connected with the arrival of the Western Allies. When news broke that the city would be under the control of the four powers, the hope of ousting the Soviet troops was strengthened. By the time the British, US, and French contingents entered Berlin in July 1945, the anti-Soviet sentiments of the townspeople had become even greater. On July 1st to July 3rd, 1945, the advanced units of the Western Allies entered their sectors of Berlin, and on July 4th, the commanders-in-chief of the occupation zones arrived. In the American sector, the new authorities immediately occupied 50% of residential buildings, ordering Berliners to vacate the premises within 2 hours. This behavior of the Allies, their hostility and tactlessness, took the residents of the city by surprise. The contempt with which the Western Allies treated the Germans was in stark contrast to the behavior of the Soviet military. Russians, while off-duty, demonstrated looseness, friendliness, and even excessive sociability. During the 2 months of Soviet occupation, Berliners managed to learn the names of many Russians who made significant efforts to restore the city and help its residents. Among them were such figures as Berzarin, who could be seen standing in the ruins among the refugees at the water pumps. Tulipov, with a characteristic shaved head, who was engaged in the opening of schools. The big man, Semenov, who made efforts to provide children with milk. At first, after the arrival of the Western Allies in Berlin, there was a noticeable contrast between their approach and the methods of the Soviet administration. The Americans showed little understanding of the religious differences between Catholics and Protestants, and the French appointed overzealous communists to their sector. For a long time, the Western Allies could not find figures comparable in influence and recognition to the Soviet administrators. However, these factors did not change the general hostile attitude of the Germans towards the Soviet troops. On September 7, 1945, at Stalin's initiative, an Allied victory parade was organized in Berlin. However, the High Command of the Western Allies refused to participate in it. This parade was significantly inferior to the British parade on July 21st, both in terms of the status of guests and the number of participants. Despite the efforts of Berlin women, who tirelessly sewed Allied flags, the reaction of citizens to the parade was mixed. The Western contingents looked grand, while the Soviet equipment, T-34 tanks and mortar batteries, looked as if they had just left the battlefield. At the sight of the Soviet tanks, the Berliners burst into whistles. One of the residents of Berlin later recalled that period. Russians were strangers to us in everything. Even when they treated us well, we remained on our guard. We did what we were told, but without any desire. They quickly noticed this, and mistaking our suspicion for hostility, they themselves became hostile. Friends, subscribe to the channel and write comments on what you think about it.